Hello, I'm back with my second video in my Bible study project. So, what verses did I read this week? I read Genesis chapters 13 to 28 and Matthew chapters 5 to 8. Here are my thoughts on these, on specific chapters and verses and everything. I'm going to start with the Old Testament. So, in this section of Genesis, we get the story of Abraham and Abraham's family. And the questions I kept asking myself is, why does God keep promising blessings to this very flawed man? This man who keeps lying about his wife's relation to him and selling her for cows. This man who doubts God's promises to him repeatedly. So what we saw in last week's part of Genesis, the primary plot of that was about God and the world. God kept trying to find a righteous man to give their covenant to. But each man kept failing, and in this we see God is trying another beginning after these constant failures that came previously from Abraham. We had Adam and Eve who failed. We had a new beginning in Noah, who then became drunk and failed God. So this is a new beginning, and this time God's not going to give up. So Abraham keeps failing, but God remains faithful to him and continues to bless him. Jacob, who is Abraham's grandson, keeps failing, but God remains faithful to him, determined to see the good in people. It's also important to note that God's promises and God's blessings are that these people are going to have many children and many descendants, because then through them they can bless the whole world. So I want to talk specifically about Genesis 16. This is the story of Sarai saying to Abraham, go and sleep with my maidservant Hagar, because Sarai can't have children. So when Hagar gets pregnant, Sarai becomes jealous and chases her away. But then God comes to Hagar as she's, on her way, and says to her, "Return, I'm going to bless you with many children and descendants." And she's overjoyed, and she says, "You are the God who sees me." And to me that's such a powerful statement, to be seen by God, because here's a woman who is unimportant to other people. She's a servant, she's a woman, she's not wealthy, she was a pagan, because she came from Egypt, and God sees her and blesses her. We again see later as Sarai, now called Sarah, in Genesis chapter 21 verses 8 to 20, pushes Hagar out into the desert again with her young son, who actually comes to the verge of death. And God again comes to Hagar and says, I'm going to continue to bless you, go back. And she has faith, while Sarah and Abraham are still full of doubt. So by being felt that she is being seen is such a powerful hold on her, and allows her to have faith. Genesis 19. Yes, we're going there. The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. God hears that there are evil things being done in these cities, and he promises Abraham that if they can find 10 good people in the city, that they won't destroy it. So God sends down 2 angels who go there. They find Abraham's nephew Lot, and upon their arrival, the people of the city demand that the visitors are given to them, so they may know them, and the implication there is that they will rape them. Lot then refuses and says, "No, here, take my 2 virgin daughters instead." And the angels go, "Whoa," pull everyone back, and save them. Save Lot's family. And then Sodom and Gomorrah are destroyed. And this raised 2 questions. First of all, why was Sodom really destroyed? And 2, why was Lot offering up his daughters? So here's a part of the Bible that is hotly contested. Was Sodom destroyed because of homosexuality, or because of the violation of hospitality? I think it's important to look at the other rabbinical teachings, because there's a lot of stuff that Sodom was doing wrong besides this. And one of their major sins was that they didn't like outsiders. They didn't like foreigners. One of the things they did is, they'd have foreigners come in and they'd put them in a bed that was either too big or too small, and they would then, if the bed was too small, they'd stretch out the limbs of the foreigners, torturing them. Or if the bed was too small, they'd then chop off their limbs so that they fit in the bed. So, they weren't very nice to people. And here, I think Jay Michelson said it best, so I'm just going to quote him. He says that homosexual rape is the way in which they violate hospitality, not the essence of their transgression. Reading the story of Sodom as being about homosexuality is like reading the story of an axe murder as being about an axe. And I couldn't find a satisfactory answer for why Lot was offering up his daughters. Some people suggested that it was because he was rushed and anxious and this was the first thing that came to his mind, where others suggested that Lot knew that this offer was going to be refused. So I think that's interesting that, we're not always going to find the answers to these things that were written thousands of years ago. We don't necessarily know the mindset of these people. And continuing on with the story of Lot and his daughters, in Genesis 19, verses 30 to 38, Lot now doesn't trust God. He thinks that he's going to destroy every city, so he moves his family into a cave. And Lot's daughters believe they are the last people on earth, and that they need to continue the family line, and they need to continue humanity. So they drug their father and rape him so that they can have children. And their children are the founders of the Moabites and the Ammonites. And it's interesting because these two cultures are hostile to the Israelites who are writing the Bible, remember. And thus we see a kind of reverse origin story here that links, the enemies of Israel with incest. So I think that's kind of interesting. And then we get Genesis chapter 25 verses 29 to 34 and Genesis chapter 27, where we see that Jacob is a liar and a deceiver, but also the blessed son. So here we see he trades Esau's birthright, who's his brother and the oldest. Esau says, "I'm hungry." Jacob says, "Well, I'll give you food if you give me your birthright." And Esau's like, "Okay, whatever." What point is there having a birthright if I'm dead from hunger? And then there's another point where Isaac says he's going to bless Esau, so to come with him with some food. And instead, Jacob disguises himself as his brother and receives the blessing instead. So I was wondering what, again, we have this liar and this deceiver being blessed. And what we do see later on in Genesis is that Jacob grows. Yes, as a young man, he's deceptive and he steals his brother's birthright. Although some people also argued that Esau's actions proved he was too rash to be a good leader, whereas Jacob showed intelligence and cunning, which was valued in a leader. I just don't think this justifies his actions, but we can kind of see that Jacob was a preferred leader over Esau. Either way, Jacob does receive his own amount of deception later on in Genesis, and to be honest, he doesn't actually believe in God at this point. Not until Genesis 28 when he has the dream of Jacob's ladder. So now we're going to move on to the New Testament. Overall, Matthew's main concern is connecting the Old Testament with Jesus. And we saw that last week with the genealogy, where he linked Jesus to King David, and we see it here again. Matthew is trying to make Jesus into the new Moses. So they both come out of Egypt. They both pass through water and are blessed. They're both in the wilderness for a period of 40 years in the case of Moses, 40 years in the case of Jesus. Moses gets his commandments from the mountain, and in Matthew 5, we see the Sermon on the Mount, which is where Jesus passes on his laws. And here we see that Jesus is kind of, again, a new beginning and a new covenant with the people. Matthew chapter 5, verses 3 to 12, this is Jesus' first sermon, and it is the Beatitudes. And I found myself asking, what do each of these characteristics mean, and what do the blessings mean? Because it's all well and good to say, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for they shall inherit the kingdom of heaven." What does it mean to be poor in spirit, and what does that kingdom of heaven mean? So let's start there. The poor in spirit are generally believed to be people who are not cocky, who are not arrogant, and who realize that if not for God, they would be suffering real poverty. And their blessing as the kingdom of heaven is that they are receptive to the teachings of God and Jesus, and therefore to heaven. Some of these are straightforward, like the mourners will be comforted. The meek, I was wondering what meek means in this sense. It's generally believed to be gentle, kind, humble people, the opposite of selfish and ambitious. And it could also be interpreted as powerless. people who aren't in a position of power to do that, to make change. And the inheritance of earth could be interchanged with heaven as well, according to some, but also reflects the two different views of the end times current when Matthew was writing. So one view was that the end of the world would see all believers brought up to the kingdom of heaven, and the other was that the end times would have God come down to directly rule on earth, and the chosen people would be given dominion over the entire world, and these would be the meek, the powerless, are given power. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, not those who hunger and thirst for money and power. Blessed are the merciful, those who forgive, but not only that, but those who give as well. Blessed are the pure in heart, who have their intentions, thoughts, and not their actions. Not just their actions, I should say. So Jesus goes on in Matthew 5 to condemn Pharisees whose actions seem right, but who are not good people at heart, as their actions serve only to give them praise and to give them power on earth. And their blessing is that they will see God, that they will know God, because God is pure. Blessed are the peacemakers. These are not just pacifists, but people who bring an end to conflict, those who seek reconciliation. And they will be called the children of God. And I think that's important to say they will be called that, because we are all children of God. But peacemakers will be recognized by others as children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of their righteousness, not because they're acting like twits, not because they are deserving of persecution, but because they're acting in a way that is right, but not necessarily accepted. In Matthew chapter 5, verse 17, Jesus says that he has not come to abolish the Old Testament God, but to show how people have, taken God's word and twisted it to fit their own views. And it's with this in mind that I read the Old Testament. I'm seeking the God that forgives, that asks people to take care of other people, and wants people to be good. Because we get that explicitly in the New Testament, but not so explicitly in the Old Testament. Matthew chapter 5, verses 21 to 22, thou shalt not hate, is like the new commandment. Jesus equates hate to murder here. And we are reminded that everyone is deserving of love. We cannot hate and worship God, because God is love. And we are created in God's image, and thus are deserving of love. And this is very hard, I think, for a lot of people, myself included. Could you look at certain people and you just, don't think that they deserve God's love? I think of, for example, like Trump right now. I'm like, no, however bad a person I think he is still deserving of love. I can't hate him. And one of my favorite comics, actually, Moonshadow, really brought this to light for me when a character says, start learning to love God by loving those you cannot love. It's easy to love people who we think are deserving of love. It's not so easy to love people who we don't think are as deserving. Matthew chapter 5, verse 29, if your right eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out and throw it away. And this is the verse I pull out when people who call themselves Christians, notice that they call themselves Christians, I don't consider them to be actual Christians, argue for modesty, or, that a woman was raped or sexually harassed or assaulted because of the way she was dressed. They believe that, a woman should be covered from her neck to her ankle. And here we see Jesus saying the victim's not to be blamed. It is you who have to accept responsibility for what you've done and for what you want to do. The perpetrator has to accept responsibility for their own actions. And last week I talked about the sin committed by Adam and Eve was that they were not taking responsibility for their actions. And here we see that reinforced. He says other things after this that reinforce this as well. Take responsibility for actions, don't blame other people. Matthew, the whole of chapter 7, is where we get more characteristics that we should have as Christians. Don't be judgmental. It says work on your own feelings before pointing out the feelings of other people. And you'll never be perfect. So, keep working on yourself and don't judge other people. Be direct with God. Don't lie and deceive and play about. God knows what you want, so just ask. Here we also get the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Don't fall for charisma. Look for character. Don't act like a Christian. Don't call yourself a Christian. Be a Christian, and your actions will speak louder than words. And don't use God for your own agenda. Don't use God to seek out fame. Like the Duggars or like Girl Defined in that, just don't do that. Lastly, there's Matthew chapter 8, where we see Jesus healing the sick, calming storms. So this is Jesus bringing the kingdom to the sick, to the ailing, to the frightened, exorcises the demons, and here we see Matthew establishing his characterization of Jesus. There's a lot of foreshadowing as well to later teachings of Christ. So here we see actions that are going to foreshadow further sayings. I think particularly of one of my favorite verses in the gospel, which is Matthew chapter 11 verse 28, where Jesus says, "Come to me, all you who are weary, and I will give you rest." And we see the actions of Jesus in Matthew chapter 8, where he gives rest to the sick and to the scared. So in conclusion, I'm actually beginning to see more of the connections between the Old Testament and the New Testament. As I dive further into my understanding of the Old Testament, I can then use my knowledge of the New Testament, which I feel like I know pretty well, to see the patterns between them, especially the patterns suggesting forgiveness and love. I'm also seeing how much of the Old Testament is also a history of the known world at the time and how the beliefs and the culture are affecting the writing. For example, the detestation of Canaanites and other cultures, they were hostile at the time of the writing, so they're given unsavory origins. I also see that I have more questions about the Old Testament and more kind of interpretations of the New Testament. Although I do research both very thoroughly, I just am more comfortable in my knowledge of the New Testament than of the Old Testament. So my question to you is, what are your thoughts on the connections between the Old and New Testaments? And thank you for watching.